Welcome to Claverius Useful Phrases series. Visit our website for more interactive practice, private or group class with our business English trainers. Enjoy listening.
Always start with a good stock as the base for your soup. Always start with a good stock as the base for your soup. Simmer the bones for hours to extract maximum flavor. Simmer the bones for hours to extract maximum flavor. Cut your vegetables uniformly for even cooking. Cut your vegetables uniformly for even cooking. Sauté onions and garlic to build a flavorful base. Sauté onions and garlic to build a flavorful base. Deglaze the pan with wine to lift those brown bits. Deglaze the pan with wine to lift those brown bits. Season the broth lightly at first, you can always add more. Season the broth lightly at first, you can always add more. Use fresh herbs to brighten up the soup. Use fresh herbs to brighten up the soup. A slow simmer brings out the best flavors in a stew. A slow simmer brings out the best flavors in a stew. Brown your meat before adding it to a stew for depth of flavor. Brown your meat before adding it to a stew for depth of flavor. Skim off any foam that rises to the top to keep the broth clear. Skim off any foam that rises to the top to keep the broth clear. Add root vegetables early, they take longer to cook. Add root vegetables early, they take longer to cook. Freshly cracked black pepper adds a nice kick. Freshly cracked black pepper adds a nice kick. Use a bouquet garni to infuse soups with herbal notes. Use a bouquet garni to infuse soups with herbal notes. Puree some of the soup for a creamier texture. Puree some of the soup for a creamier texture. Stir occasionally to prevent ingredients from sticking. Stir occasionally to prevent ingredients from sticking. A splash of vinegar or lemon juice can brighten the flavors. A splash of vinegar or lemon juice can brighten the flavors. Let the stew rest before serving to let the flavors meld. Let the stew rest before serving to let the flavors meld. Use a heavy-bottomed pot to distribute heat evenly. Use a heavy-bottomed pot to distribute heat evenly. Add dairy at the end to prevent curdling. Add dairy at the end to prevent curdling. Test for doneness by piercing vegetables with a fork. Test for doneness by piercing vegetables with a fork. A pinch of sugar can balance out acidic flavors. A pinch of sugar can balance out acidic flavors. Add fresh herbs at the end for a burst of color and flavor. Add fresh herbs at the end for a burst of color and flavor. Use a food mill to achieve a smooth consistency. Use a food mill to achieve a smooth consistency. Ladle off excess fat for a healthier dish. Ladle off excess fat for a healthier dish. A bit of cornstarch slurry can thicken a thin soup. A bit of cornstarch slurry can thicken a thin soup.
Visit Claverius.com for more interactive practice.
Allow the soup to cool slightly before blending. Allow the soup to cool slightly before blending. Add cooked pasta or rice just before serving. Add cooked pasta or rice just before serving. Roast vegetables to deepen their flavor before adding to the soup. Roast vegetables to deepen their flavor before adding to the soup. Keep the lid on to trap steam and cook more quickly. Keep the lid on to trap steam and cook more quickly. Use a mix of meat cuts for a more complex flavor. Use a mix of meat cuts for a more complex flavor. Add seafood in the last few minutes to prevent overcooking. Add seafood in the last few minutes to prevent overcooking. Use leftover roasted meats for a hearty soup. Use leftover roasted meats for a hearty soup. Caramelize onions for a richer flavor base. Caramelize onions for a richer flavor base. A dash of soy sauce can add umami depth. A dash of soy sauce can add umami depth. Strain the broth if you prefer a clear soup. Strain the broth if you prefer a clear soup. Add croutons or toasted bread for texture. Add croutons or toasted bread for texture. Use a splash of cream for a luxurious finish. Use a splash of cream for a luxurious finish. A sprinkle of cheese can add richness. A sprinkle of cheese can add richness. Add beans for extra protein and fiber. Add beans for extra protein and fiber. Use a slow cooker for a hands-off approach. Use a slow cooker for a hands-off approach. Keep the pot partially covered to control evaporation. Keep the pot partially covered to control evaporation. Add tomatoes for acidity and color. Add tomatoes for acidity and color. Use wine to deglaze for added complexity. Use wine to deglaze for added complexity. Incorporate seasonal vegetables for fresh flavors. Incorporate seasonal vegetables for fresh flavors. Blanch vegetables before adding to the soup to retain color. Blanch vegetables before adding to the soup to retain color. Season in layers for a well-rounded flavor. Season in layers for a well-rounded flavor. Use a meat thermometer to ensure meat is cooked through. Use a meat thermometer to ensure meat is cooked through. Add a splash of sherry for a sophisticated note. Add a splash of sherry for a sophisticated note. Use a mix of fresh and dried herbs for depth. Use a mix of fresh and dried herbs for depth. Toast spices before adding them to release their oils. Toast spices before adding them to release their oils.
Visit Claverius.com for more interactive practice.
A bit of nutmeg can enhance creamy soups. A bit of nutmeg can enhance creamy soups. Use different types of potatoes for varied textures. Use different types of potatoes for varied textures. Toss in a Parmesan rind for added umami. Toss in a Parmesan rind for added umami. Simmer soup gently to maintain clarity. Simmer soup gently to maintain clarity. Add bacon or pancetta for a smoky undertone. Add bacon or pancetta for a smoky undertone. Use coconut milk for a creamy, dairy-free option. Use coconut milk for a creamy, dairy-free option. A splash of hot sauce can add a spicy kick. A splash of hot sauce can add a spicy kick. Use lentils for a protein-rich, hearty stew. Use lentils for a protein-rich, hearty stew. Add barley for a chewy texture. Add barley for a chewy texture. A touch of honey can balance bitter flavors. A touch of honey can balance bitter flavors. Incorporate leafy greens for added nutrition. Incorporate leafy greens for added nutrition. Sear meat in batches to avoid crowding the pan. Sear meat in batches to avoid crowding the pan. Place a slice of bread on top to absorb excess oil. Place a slice of bread on top to absorb excess oil. Add dumplings for a comforting touch. Add dumplings for a comforting touch. Use a variety of mushrooms for an earthy flavor. Use a variety of mushrooms for an earthy flavor. Add a cinnamon stick for a hint of spice. Add a cinnamon stick for a hint of spice. Use fish sauce sparingly for an umami boost. Use fish sauce sparingly for an umami boost. Roast garlic before adding for a mellow flavor. Roast garlic before adding for a mellow flavor. Add a splash of brandy for richness. Add a splash of brandy for richness. Use fresh cracked pepper for a sharper taste. Use fresh cracked pepper for a sharper taste. Add a dollop of pesto for a burst of flavor. Add a dollop of pesto for a burst of flavor. Use a splash of apple cider vinegar for a tangy note. Use a splash of apple cider vinegar for a tangy note. Add shredded chicken for a quick protein boost. Add shredded chicken for a quick protein boost. Use a roux to thicken creamy soups. Use a roux to thicken creamy soups. Incorporate fennel for a subtle anise flavor. Incorporate fennel for a subtle anise flavor.
Visit Claverius.com for more interactive practice.
Add zucchini or squash for a touch of sweetness. Add zucchini or squash for a touch of sweetness. Use smoked paprika for a deep, smoky flavor. Use smoked paprika for a deep, smoky flavor. Shred cheese directly into the soup for smooth melting. Shred cheese directly into the soup for smooth melting. Incorporate fresh corn for a touch of sweetness. Incorporate fresh corn for a touch of sweetness. Use a pinch of saffron for a luxurious aroma. Use a pinch of saffron for a luxurious aroma. Add a touch of Worcestershire sauce for depth. Add a touch of Worcestershire sauce for depth. Use a potato masher to partially crush ingredients. Use a potato masher to partially crush ingredients. Add cooked sausage for a hearty touch. Add cooked sausage for a hearty touch. Incorporate kale for added texture and nutrition. Incorporate kale for added texture and nutrition. Add a splash of balsamic vinegar for sweetness. Add a splash of balsamic vinegar for sweetness. Use a stick blender for easy pureeing. Use a stick blender for easy pureeing. Add a touch of cream cheese for richness. Add a touch of cream cheese for richness. Use a mix of spices like cumin and coriander for complexity. Use a mix of spices like cumin and coriander for complexity. Add a squeeze of lime juice for brightness. Add a squeeze of lime juice for brightness. Use leftover vegetables to minimize waste. Use leftover vegetables to minimize waste. Add a dash of hot chili flakes for heat. Add a dash of hot chili flakes for heat. Use a bit of miso paste for umami. Use a bit of miso paste for umami. Incorporate roasted peppers for depth. Incorporate roasted peppers for depth. Add a pinch of smoked salt for complexity. Add a pinch of smoked salt for complexity. Use a splash of sake for a unique twist. Use a splash of sake for a unique twist. Add quinoa for added protein. Add quinoa for added protein. Use a bit of turmeric for color and health benefits. Use a bit of turmeric for color and health benefits. Incorporate beans for a hearty texture. Incorporate beans for a hearty texture. Add spinach for a burst of green. Add spinach for a burst of green. Use a bit of ginger for a warming effect. Use a bit of ginger for a warming effect.
Visit Claverius.com for more interactive practice.
Add roasted tomatoes for a rich flavor. Add roasted tomatoes for a rich flavor. Use a dash of fish sauce for umami. Use a dash of fish sauce for umami. Incorporate sweet potatoes for a touch of sweetness. Incorporate sweet potatoes for a touch of sweetness. Add a pinch of allspice for warmth. Add a pinch of allspice for warmth. Use a bit of coconut cream for richness. Use a bit of coconut cream for richness. Add a splash of red wine for depth. Add a splash of red wine for depth. Use a pinch of fennel seeds for a hint of licorice. Use a pinch of fennel seeds for a hint of licorice. Incorporate leeks for a subtle onion flavor. Incorporate leeks for a subtle onion flavor. Add a dollop of Greek yogurt for creaminess. Add a dollop of Greek yogurt for creaminess. Use a dash of Tabasco sauce for heat. Use a dash of Tabasco sauce for heat. Add roasted garlic for depth. Add roasted garlic for depth. Incorporate fresh basil for a burst of flavor. Incorporate fresh basil for a burst of flavor. Use a bit of truffle oil for luxury. Use a bit of truffle oil for luxury. Add a splash of orange juice for brightness. Add a splash of orange juice for brightness. Use a pinch of cardamom for a unique twist. Use a pinch of cardamom for a unique twist. Incorporate roasted nuts for texture. Incorporate roasted nuts for texture. Add a squeeze of lemon for freshness. Add a squeeze of lemon for freshness. Use a bit of blue cheese for richness. Use a bit of blue cheese for richness. Add roasted pumpkin for sweetness. Add roasted pumpkin for sweetness. Incorporate fresh dill for a burst of flavor. Incorporate fresh dill for a burst of flavor. Use a dash of soy sauce for umami. Use a dash of soy sauce for umami. Add roasted Brussels sprouts for depth. Add roasted Brussels sprouts for depth. Incorporate fresh mint for a refreshing touch. Incorporate fresh mint for a refreshing touch. Use a bit of almond milk for creaminess. Use a bit of almond milk for creaminess. Add roasted apples for a touch of sweetness. Add roasted apples for a touch of sweetness.
Visit Claverius.com for more interactive practice.
Incorporate fresh tarragon for a hint of licorice. Incorporate fresh tarragon for a hint of licorice. Use a pinch of paprika for warmth. Use a pinch of paprika for warmth. Add roasted carrots for sweetness. Add roasted carrots for sweetness. Incorporate fresh parsley for brightness. Incorporate fresh parsley for brightness. Use a bit of beef broth for richness. Use a bit of beef broth for richness. Add a dash of sherry vinegar for tanginess. Add a dash of sherry vinegar for tanginess. Incorporate roasted beets for earthiness. Incorporate roasted beets for earthiness. Use a pinch of nutmeg for warmth. Use a pinch of nutmeg for warmth. Add roasted garlic for depth. Add roasted garlic for depth. Incorporate fresh thyme for a burst of flavor. Incorporate fresh thyme for a burst of flavor. Use a bit of chicken broth for richness. Use a bit of chicken broth for richness. Add a splash of white wine for brightness. Add a splash of white wine for brightness. Incorporate fresh cilantro for a burst of flavor. Incorporate fresh cilantro for a burst of flavor. Use a bit of vegetable broth for richness. Use a bit of vegetable broth for richness. Add a squeeze of lime for freshness. Add a squeeze of lime for freshness. Incorporate fresh oregano for a burst of flavor. Incorporate fresh oregano for a burst of flavor. Use a bit of tomato paste for richness. Use a bit of tomato paste for richness. Add roasted butternut squash for sweetness. Add roasted butternut squash for sweetness. Incorporate fresh rosemary for a burst of flavor. Incorporate fresh rosemary for a burst of flavor. Use a bit of clam juice for depth. Use a bit of clam juice for depth. Add a splash of lemon juice for brightness. Add a splash of lemon juice for brightness. Incorporate fresh chives for a burst of flavor. Incorporate fresh chives for a burst of flavor. Use a bit of pork broth for richness. Use a bit of pork broth for richness. Add a squeeze of grapefruit for freshness. Add a squeeze of grapefruit for freshness. Incorporate fresh sage for a burst of flavor. Incorporate fresh sage for a burst of flavor.
Thank you for listening Claverius Business English Series. Visit our website for more interactive practice, private or group live session with our business English trainers.